And you can do that here, or you can, yeah.
Well, good evening.
Hi, Michael.
That's good. Yeah, thank you. Well, I've been a full-time farmer since 1976, primarily on larger kind of production scale. But in 1987, when suburbia surrounded the farm that I was on in California, and it essentially became an island floating in a sea of tract homes and shopping centers, I started an organization which I called the Center for Urban Agriculture. Now, this was long before anyone was using the words urban and agriculture in the same sentence. I realized at that time that the majority of the world's people were now living in cities, that all their essential nourishment was being shipped in via virtually an armada of trains and trucks and ships, and that this was an incredibly precarious situation. And so we started production farms, not gardens, on entire abandoned city blocks in places like Watts in LA, which a neighborhood that in comparison makes the downtown east side look like Beverly Hills, which it seems to be becoming like a little bit more. That was an add-on. I realized early on that I could not think about ecological issues without considering the associated social issues. I cannot consider what makes a city green in regards to food and transportation, energy, waste, etc., without considering whether everyone has equal access to those services. Now, I'm very proud to be part of this amazing city and to see the great leadership that those in city government and others are providing in greening Vancouver. But I do not believe we can call ourselves green until everyone has a place to go home to at night, a healthy meal to eat every day, clean water to drink, and clean air to breathe. These things are not luxuries. They are the birthright of every individual. Now, I'm going to skip the, I was going to give you a little bit more meat to this about urban agriculture, but I'll say one thing about that. Now, I don't feel that we can feed our cities entirely from within our cities. I think this is a bit of a romantic view. A more practical conversation around urban food security and its place in greening cities would consider the relationship, the proper relationship, between urban, peri-urban, and rural agriculture. What is appropriate to produce where? How do we share resources such as water and minerals? How do we begin to view the food system not in isolation, but in relation? And I'm going to skip ahead because I had some specific suggestions in regards to that, but I don't have time. It's going to be the 6 minutes. Okay, all right, I'll go for it. All right. Somebody else, okay. So if we are serious about food and urban food production as a central piece of greening our city, we might do what the Cubans did. Establish publicly supported agricultural training centers in central and accessible locations and have teams of extension agents in numbers proportionate to the population devoted to urban food production working in our communities. The nutrient cycle that once tied farms with those they supplied has been seriously interrupted. We need a full cycle food system that allows for the return of organic waste via central regional composting facilities that can support the nutrient needs of both urban and urban fringe farms. And I know there are folks that are working on this, but an essential piece of our greenness is tied to both reducing what comes into our communities from elsewhere, but also reducing what leaves our communities, especially if it has nutritional or soil conditioning values for our local farms and gardens. We need to stand behind the work that is happening here in Vancouver to fund and construct a permanent covered year-round farmers' food market space in a dominant central location. And we need to recognize this type of physical space and farmers' markets in general as equal, if not more important, to our civic health as the public swimming pool, the sports fields, schools, churches, and libraries. Every new permit for a housing development should be required to have an approved food production component on a scale relative to the number of people who will be living there. We should initiate a phase out of all lawns effective immediately. But that's kind of a cliche. What we must provide are neighborhood training programs and technical support for home and building owners to replace those lawns with food production. Okay, that's important. Every neighborhood school, church, and sports facility could be required to restructure existing facilities to accommodate cooperative canning, freezing, and dehydrating services for their neighborhoods and communities during non-peak evening and weekend hours. Those wonderful stainless steel kitchens that are sitting idle for much of the day. And finally, every real estate transaction could have a small urban farmland preservation tax from which lands could be purchased specifically for the production of food. Okay? Now, in considering both what makes a city green and how we go about achieving that greenness, I'm reminded of my relationship with the sustainable agricultural movement over the last, I don't know, almost 40 years. I have always said that sustainability in agriculture is not so much a goal we arrive at, but for there are no truly sustainable farms. Sustainability is more a series of questions we ask ourselves each day when we get out of bed. Questions that require us to consider everything we do on our farms. How our farms impact the land and community that surrounds them. The quality of our food. Who has access to that food? How far it travels from the field to the plate. Questions about the well-being of our staff, those whose hands cultivate and harvest our crops. About the water we use and how clean it is when it leaves our farms. About the millions of micro and macroorganisms that inhabit our soils, and on and on. And so when I think about Vancouver, I consider its greenness in the same way. I want to know that everyone can take part in the benefits of that. And I want to know that we're all willing to dig deeply to find the core of what green really is. Go beyond the obvious. Go beyond window dressing or just the appearance of green. And look deeply at the foundations of our city, ecologically, interpersonally, nutritionally, socially, spiritually, biologically. In the area I work in, I like to say that we do not really have a food crisis as much as we have a crisis of participation. 2% of the entire population growing the vital nourishment for the rest. This is where the real problems come from. And ultimately, and similarly, to make Vancouver green may require that everyone participate in the process. We may need to judge our greenness not as something that can be achieved by Vancouver in isolation, as if the city is floating in its own universe separate from the rest of the world, but Vancouver as a community inextricably connected to every other community that surrounds us. And as such, our city may only be as green as the broader world in which it exists. Thank you.